Okay, I've got good news for you. We're finally going to start sewing today. And we're also going to talk about seam allowance, chain piecing, seam ripping, and pressing. So there is a lot of ground to cover in this video. So let's get started and talk about seam allowance. So what is seam allowance? It's the fabric between the edge of the fabric and the seam line. So all of this in here is seam allowance. This is all seam allowance. And this is also doubled up, remember. So you have your seam allowance for your top fabric and you have the seam allowance for your bottom fabric. Now, when I was learning to quilt years and years ago, it was generally understood that the universal seam allowance for quilting was a good, sturdy, solid 1/4 inch. But in the last couple of years, I've heard more and more people talking about defaulting to a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that basically is a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but it is just shy of a 1/4 inch. It's just a few stitches over, or not stitches, a few threads over. And that doesn't seem like a lot. It's a very slight adjustment, but it can make a very big difference. You would be surprised. In fact, this is a sturdy 1/4 inch, and this is a scant 1/4 inch. And with your naked eye, it's very hard to see the difference. Let's line up the edges. It is very slightly different. So you can see, if you're looking at the ruler, the seam line for the regular 1/4 inch is lining up right on that line. But the scant 1/4 inch is right beside the 1/4 inch line. And honestly, if you're feeling skeptical about the difference between these two, I don't blame you. It really takes experience to see the difference, and also it really shows up in more complicated blocks. I also just recently saw a thread in a quilting group that I'm a member of, and people were talking about using 3/8 of an inch or 1/2 an inch seam allowance, which I just find absolutely mind-boggling, especially when you think about this in terms of fabric waste. So each seam allowance eats up fabric, no matter which size you use. With a standard 1/4 inch seam allowance, you're losing a 1/4 inch from both pieces of fabric for a total of a 1/2 an inch. So if you're using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, you're losing an inch of fabric in each seam, and that adds up so fast, and I wouldn't recommend it, especially with the rising cost of fabric these days. For right now, let's just ignore the debate and aim for an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. And let's focus on being consistent instead of being right. So we're not going to stress about it at this point. We're just going to aim for a good 1/4 inch. But do keep in mind, for any future quilting you might do, patterns are written with 1/4 inch seam allowances in mind, and the seam allowance is included in the cutting instructions. So you don't have to add on your seam allowances unless you're modifying them and making them larger. There's a lot more I could say on the subject of seam allowance, but I'm going to spare you. I'm not going to subject you to that. So let's just move on. There are a lot of ways you can get a good, consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance, and my favorite is these little stickers. And I'll leave a link in the description. You start out by getting a pack with this setting piece, and then after you run out of the stickers in that pack, you can get refill packs. And this is what I use like almost exclusively. I really like them. They last a long time, especially if you treat them right. So basically, you have this little hook here. It goes like this, and it hooks on your needle, and you put your sticker here, and you press it down, and it's really great. And it doesn't leave any tacky residue after you take them up. I also got this magnetic seam guide, and it works fine, but I'm not a super huge fan of it. I do, however, like this ruler that came with it. So let me flip it around. So these are different seam allowances you can use. Here's your 1/4 inch seam allowance right up here. And all you do is you drop your needle down into that hole. You get a nice straight edge here, and then you can put your magnet up against it like that. And you want to make sure you have a good magnetic base if you're going to get one of these, because not all machines have that. So you might have something that's plastic and this won't work at all. If that's the case, I still recommend getting this guy because it is great. And then what you can do is you can stack pieces of painter's tape on top of each other and sort of mimic one of these. You might be able to do it with masking tape, although I think masking tape is much thinner than painter's tape, so you might need to make more layers. But anyway, you would stack them up, and then you could stick them down using this to line it up perfectly. Alternatively, a lot of sewing machines come with a 1/4 inch foot. So you have this little guide right here, and you'll just butt up your fabric against that guide and put it through your machine like normal, and you've got a really great 1/4 inch seam. I should also mention this seam tape that I see a lot of sewing content creators use. I haven't personally used it, but I've seen it like everywhere, so I think it is well loved within the community. And it does a couple different things than just a 1/4 inch seam. And I think that's on their packaging, but I'm not sure. So as much as I recommend seam guides, they aren't universally perfect. There are ways to check to make sure that they're accurate. I'm not going to cover them here because I don't want you to get bogged down in the details, but we might talk about that later on if you're interested. And also, back to that 1/4 inch versus scant 1/4 inch, these actually are billed as scant 1/4 inch guides. But I actually move the needle on my machine to the left to get a 1/4 inch. But again, we are focusing on consistency here and not super accurate 1/4 inch. Not in our very first quilt. I want to take a moment to really help you visualize what I mean when I say that seam allowance eats up fabric. So this is block 1 unsewn. These pieces are all still separate. Now let's compare that to block 1 all sewn up. And you can really see the difference. It's more than this end piece in difference and seam allowance eaten up. Because remember, each seam is 1/2 inch gone, and we have 7 seams here. So that's 3.5 inches gone, eaten up in the seam allowance in the back. Now let's talk about how we get our pieces ready to take to the machine. So first of all, when I was a beginner quilter, I thought that you would sew these 2 pieces together, and then you would sew this piece onto that, and this piece onto that, and so on down the line. So 1 piece at a time. But we are actually going to be doing something called chain sewing. So instead of sewing these 2 together and then this one, we're actually going to split our pieces into pairs. So we'll sew these 2 pieces together, these 2 together, these 2 and these 2. Then after we have sewn them and pressed them, then we're going to sew these 2 units together, and then these 2 units together. And then once again, after they have been sewn and pressed, we'll sew them both together for our final block. Sewing this way is a great way to save time and just keep up your momentum while you're sewing. Chain sewing might look a little bit different when you're sewing a more complex block. So for instance, with this block, you might sew together all of these pieces at once for like your whole quilt. So say you have like 20 blocks you're making, you might sew all of these together. Then you might move on to your half square triangles. And then from there, maybe you do all of these square in a square, and so on and so forth until you have all of your pieces ready to put together into your final block. In the case of this block here, I just made just this single block. So instead of just doing these pieces and then moving on to this and then moving on to this, I actually did it all at once. So it was much faster that way. When it comes to putting your blocks together, I suggest that you keep your pattern handy. So if you have the PDF, print it out and keep it around. If you have a screenshot, keep your phone around and somewhere that it's easy to reference. For instance, I keep my pattern taped up above my workstation, so I can just glance up whenever I need to reference it, and it stays off of my table so I don't have to keep moving it or my ceiling fan doesn't blow it away. As far as chain piecing goes, I recommend that you go ahead and sew all of your block 1s all at once, then all of your block 2s, then all of your 3s, and then all of your 4s. If you do it this way, it should help you stay organized more easily, and also you'll only need to have one of your reference block patterns up at a time. Okay, let's put these pieces together. We're going to put every pair of pieces right sides together. So it looks like that. The right side of your fabric is the side of the fabric that's printed. So the people will often call it the pretty side of the fabric. So there's the right side, here's the wrong side. Usually there's a pretty clear right and wrong side to fabric, unless we're talking about something like solid fabric, which doesn't have a right or wrong side, or batik fabric. And the differences between right and wrong on batik they hardly matter most of the time. So I wouldn't stress about that if you're using batik or solid fabric. So I'm going to continue right sides together, right sides together, right sides together. As a beginner quilter, you might want to use your pins. I like these extra long ones. Or you might want to use these clips. Whichever you feel more comfortable with. I prefer to piece without pins or clips, but if I have to choose between one or the other, I'll choose a pin because I feel like it's maybe a little bit more secure than the clips. But again, that's just my personal preference. You'll want to match up your edges to the best of your ability. You scooch it and nudge it into place. And then when I use a pin, I like to actually go in twice. Instead of just going once like that, I like to go twice, right next to each other, like that. I just feel like it makes it just that little bit more secure. I recommend if it's your very first time sewing to do a pin in the beginning, the middle, and the end of your piece. If I am pinning, I usually skip the first one because I can arrange that easily at the machine and then just have a middle and an end pin. Also, some people will actually put their pins in different angles. So I've seen people who pin going up like this, like that. I've seen people who pin from the other side. They'll pin like this. Or even people who will pin at an angle, like that. So this again comes down to personal preference. I think people usually choose based on how easy it is to remove them while they're sewing. Also, because this was just a quick demonstration, I wouldn't pin this far from the edge. I would actually pin as close to the edge as I can because that's the part that I want to really make sure stays together. So I would do it like that. And of course, as you're doing it, you're going to be trying to keep these edges as even as possible. Okay? I guess in a way it is much simpler to just, stick a clip on it. So whichever way you like. But again, I mostly don't use pins or clips. I have a lot of experience with pinless piecing. I would recommend that you do not try pinless piecing right off the bat and maybe work up to it when you're feeling a little bit more comfortable with sewing and piecing. Also, if you are using this type of seam guide and pins and clips at the same time, you'll find that the guides don't last quite as long because the pins and clips will often pull and snag at it. So there is a way to help make them last a little longer, and that's as you're sewing, if you take your pins out before you get to your seam guide, or if you make sure as you're coming up to the edge right here, you make sure and lift the pin or guide the pin over the seam guide instead of getting caught at that edge and pulling at it. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you are using pins, do your absolute best to not sew over them. I know you're not going to make it 100% of the time. Sometimes you're just going to forget, and that's fine. Everyone makes mistakes. But if you sew over your pins, you're risking breaking your pin. I have bent mine completely at a 90-degree angle, making them completely useless. It can also break your sewing machine needle, which is an absolute pain, especially if you're in the middle of like maybe a long seam or a very time-consuming block. And even if your needle doesn't break, it can still dull the needle if it hits the pin. And when you have a dull needle, it can affect your tension and all sorts of things with your machine. And it makes you have to replace your needle more often, which is very annoying. So do yourself a favor and do not sew over these puppies. When you pin and clip, it's pretty easy to keep an eye on which side you're sewing on. But when you're pinless, I need to be extra organized. I don't actually line up my pieces very much until I get to the machine. I just get a rough match, and then I'll do sort of a cascading stack. For pairs like this, where the fabric on top is bigger than the one on bottom, I'm actually going to flip it, being mindful of keeping the side that I want to sew on in the same position, and then I'll add that to my cascading stack. So I'll do the same with this one too. Just roughly line that up. I'll do the exact same thing with this block one, and then after I've made a cascading stack, as I like to call it, I'm going to put it perpendicular to my first one, and I will go off and on like that just to keep everything super organized and together. I like to keep my pieces in a little holding area over here that's near me, but away from the action and movement of my immediate sewing space. So over here, it's not going to get bumped or messed up or knocked off of my table, but I can still have it real close to me and easy to access. Before you sew, you might consider winding a couple extra bobbins. This helps you to not lose steam while you're quilting, and it also means that you don't have to, stop your machine, unthread your machine, wind your bobbin, rethread your machine every time you need a fresh bobbin. So it'll save you some frustration later on. You'll also want to make sure that your machine is ready for sewing. So is your machine threaded correctly? Is your needle threaded? Is your bobbin installed correctly? Is the bed of your sewing machine clean? Do you need a fresh machine needle? All that kind of stuff. It's also a good idea to check your tension before you get started, and I do that using this fabric scrap. It's messy, but it is effective. So every time I want to sew, I will start off by sewing a straight line on this, and then I will get real close and I'll check the front and the back. Oops, even messier on that side, to make sure that my stitches are even. And basically, the simple explanation of tension is that you want the stitches on the top of your fabric to look the same as the stitches on the back of your fabric. Oh, that's messy. And if they match, I am ready to sew. If, however, they do not match, go ahead and make sure you can find the section in your sewing machine manual that goes over tension and how to adjust the tension, because every machine is a little bit different. And I know that incorrect tension might not seem like a super huge deal, but it will lower the lifespan of your quilt. It will result in subpar seams, and it's just not very good craftsmanship. So try to keep your eye on your tension, even though it can be a little bit of a struggle to get it just right in the beginning. Okay, we're finally at the sewing machine. Yay! But I do want to take a moment to just ask you to be patient with me in this process, because I don't have a bunch of fancy equipment. I have a flimsy tripod and a camera phone, and it's right in front of my face while I'm trying to sew, so I can't see very well over here. So please be patient with me. I'm trying my best. I'm going to go ahead and turn on my sewing machine. The needle always does this little dance to just make sure it's aligned perfectly where it's supposed to be in its default setting. I like to keep my threads managed, so I have the top thread going through the presser foot down below, and I keep them out to the side here so they're easy to grab when I start sewing. I also mentioned before that this is a scant 1/4 inch guide, and look how rough it looks. I've been using it for a while. But it's scant and I want a true 1/4 inch, so I move my needle over to 3.0 instead of 3.5, and it really doesn't look like it's that big of a difference, but it can make a big difference over time. And I'm going to do my quick tension test. Not trying to line anything up or anything. And in case you missed the anatomy of the sewing machine video, I recommend you go back and watch that. I'm using my presser foot lever here to put my presser foot down. Most machines, at least the ones that I have used, will not sew unless your presser foot is down. So make sure, if you're having trouble getting your machine started, make sure your presser foot is down. Now I'm just going to do a quick line. Lift the presser foot, and then I'm going to use my built-in thread cutter over here to cut that, and then I can get a nice quick look. Front, back, looks good. I'm ready to sew. So my pieces are over here, down there, and I'll get my first pairing, and this is the point where I line up my pieces, is at the sewing machine. And again, I am managing my threads, keeping them neat and tidy, because I don't want them to get pulled back and knotted up in my fabric, because then I will have something called a thread nest. That's something we want to avoid because it adds bulk to your seams, and they can also be difficult to remove when we need to seam rip, because we do always eventually, in my experience, need to seam rip at least once when I'm making a quilt. So I am going to align my fabric up against my seam guide here, and I want it to just be shy of where my needle is going to come down. I don't want it to be too far forward, because then the top part will be left unsewn. And I don't want to leave it too far back because then my feed dogs down here won't be able to grab it and pull it forward. So that'll take just a little bit of maneuvering until you get used to it. And then I'm going to use my needle down function because I'm not using pins. I also sort of use my fingers as, sort of like pins when I'm sewing. I'll be placing them strategically. Like I keep one sort of here and here, if you can see that, sort of near the presser foot, not in front of the presser foot. And I'll put pressure down just to help my fabric to keep from shifting. And then I'll use this hand to make sure that the fabric is meeting. There's my cat. I'll use this hand to make sure my fabric is meeting the seam guide and also keeping an eye on my fabric matching up along the edge. Now, I do recommend that you sew slowly, and if you're having a hard time regulating your speed, you might have something like this on your machine that you can crank all the way down to make sure it keeps you going slow. I like it up high even though I don't go fast. I like the option once in a while. But I do recommend you go slow for a few reasons. Number one, you'll make mistakes slower and it'll be easier to correct them that way. Number two, it is easier to stay consistent, especially for new quilters. And number three, it should help you keep your top fabric from stretching. And this is actually a problem I've had with high-end and lower-end machines. The top fabric stretching just a little bit out of alignment with the bottom fabric. But that's not to say that there aren't some experienced quilters that are speed demons. But for myself, I found that I can either sew quickly or I can sew accurately. So there is no in between, and I prefer accuracy. Okay, I'm going to start sewing. And one thing, if you have done sewing before, people will often tell you to use your backstitch at the beginning and end of every seam. That's not necessary for quilting. And if you make a mistake and have to pick it out, it's extra hard. So we're going to just go ahead and start. I will often keep my threads in my hand for that first couple stitches and then let go. Whoops. Sometimes I might stop and realign my fabric, but that's just because I don't have pins, and then I'll keep going. It's also important to make sure that you're not pulling your fabric back or putting too much tension on it, because that can also stretch your pieces. So be mindful of how you use your hands and how you manipulate your fabric as you're sewing. So you might be tempted to hold it like this, but you might be putting extra tension on your fabric. So again, I will put it down, my fingers strategically down here, but I'm going to move my fingers at the same time. And I'm going to use this hand to make sure that my fabric is staying lined up with the seam guide. Okay, now instead of lifting our presser foot and cutting the thread for our piece, we're going to actually just add our next piece, our next pair. So I'm going to line them up as best as I can, especially because I can't see very well at the moment. And then I'll lift my presser foot and put it under there. So I have it lined up on the side and I can get started again. And then I'll do it again and again until I've finished sewing all of my pieces. I feel like because this is a beginner class, I should show you each and every piece that I sew, but I also don't want to bore you. So I'm going to sew this off camera and then I'll bring you right back here. Okay, and that is my last piece in my chain sewing because I'm only doing 2 blocks for this demonstration. So I'm going to lift my presser foot, I'm going to gather my pieces, and before I cut the thread in the machine that's holding my blocks, I'm actually going to get my first block. I'm going to use my snips to snip these threads, and I recommend you are mindful of snipping threads now so you don't have to do it later and like do it all at once, because it is so tedious to hunt them down and snip them and get them neat. So I'll one by one cut these apart. There is a tool you can buy, and I'll put a link to it, but it is specifically for cutting apart chain piecing. So cut, 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 and then we're going to press. And then I get to my last one, and I'm already holding my snips, so I may as well use them here. Now I'm going to take my pile to my pressing table. After you have sewn your first set of pieces, it is a good idea to see if you have to do any seam ripping. There are people who hate their seam rippers, and you know, it's probably because it makes them feel like they have failed, but I'm telling you, you've had a mini victory when you use your seam ripper, because you have found a mistake when it's early enough to fix it. I'm telling you, it is so much worse, more demoralizing to find a mistake in a finished quilt than it is to find a mistake in an unfinished block. There are actually a ton of reasons why you might need to get your seam ripper out, including maybe your fabric is misaligned, meaning you have something overlapping incorrectly instead of meeting at the sides. Maybe your seam line is crooked, or maybe one of your strips got misaligned as you were sewing and didn't get caught very evenly in the seam allowance. Your tension might be off. You might have accidentally stretched your fabric. You might have accidentally sewn with your pieces with the wrong sides together instead of the right sides together. So when you open it up, you don't have the pretty printed pieces facing, you have these pieces facing instead. You might have sewn an extra piece on. I have done that actually, where I open it up and I realize I actually have a third piece back here. And you only want 2 pieces sewn together in each seam, not 3. Maybe you sewed the wrong pieces together. Maybe it's in the wrong order, or you accidentally mixed up pieces from different blocks. Those are all possible reasons, and I'm sure there's way more that I haven't listed. So you really shouldn't feel bad if you have to use your seam ripper. It's just part of the process, and it's there to help you. Let's go over a couple different ways to use your seam ripper. I personally only know 2 ways. I'm sure there's more. There's always more. I've also seen a tool that like shaves the seam. I don't know how it works, but they shave that top seam. I've also seen scissors where part of the scissor goes underneath the stitch and you cut it that way. So there's a lot of tools, but I'm going to show you the way that I know. So you can either do this quick and messy or slow and neat. The quick and messy way is to open up your seam like this, and then usually this is a pretty old seam ripper. The newer ones usually have a rubber ball right here, and that's the piece that you want to go down underneath the fabric, because that way you won't damage it. So basically what you're going to do is feed the seam ripper through that seam line. And this is my absolute least favorite way to seam rip, but you push your seam ripper through your stitches, and oh, you see what I just did? I pushed it through the fabric, and that is the reason why I hate this method. I have never perfected it this way, and I always make an absolute mess, and I stretch it. And when you seam rip this way, that's a little easier if you hold it to the side, I guess. But when you seam rip this way, you're also making a mess because you're cutting both pieces of thread. So you're going to end up with more of these like shaggy little bits that you're going to have to clean up. See, more of these things. The other way is the slow and neat way, and this is my preferred way to do it. So what you're going to do is you're going to put your seam ripper underneath the stitch and cut it. And you're going to do that every few stitches, maybe every 3 or 4 stitches. I start out doing them pretty close, and then I get lazy and do them farther and farther apart. Anyway, you would do this all the way down your seam. I'm not going to take the time to go all the way down, but then you can flip it over and pick that thread. And this thread on the back is going to stay intact all the way down. So you're dealing with half the amount of these little ripped pieces. And again, this method is really great for me personally because I don't accidentally rip my fabric with my seam ripper. If you're doing a lot of seam ripping, it can be really annoying to pick out these little pieces. One way to get it done faster is to use a lint roller. This is a very linty roller. And you just go over it like that, and boom, they're gone. Oops, except for that guy. There you go. And of course, this piece you don't have to worry about as much because it's going to stay whole all the way down. So those are your 2 main ways to seam rip. And if you personally have more experience with seam ripping, maybe you do garments and stuff and you have some tips, will you leave those in the comment section for our first-time sewers and for me, because I'd like to know some more ways too. After you have done your seam ripping and you fixed everything and re-sewn all your pieces, then it is time to press. And like a lot of the things we've been doing, it might seem like it's not that big of a deal and it won't make a difference, but I promise you, it really, really does. The way that you press your fabric can actually be a bit of a controversial topic in the quilting world. Some people are absolute diehards when it comes to their preferred method. So either you are going to press your seams open, like this one here, or you're going to press your seams to the side. And I promise you, there are quilters who take this very, very seriously. They are firmly entrenched in their opinions and everyone else is wrong. So personally, I use them both. I think it's just 2 different tools in your tool belt. I just use them for different purposes. And they definitely both have their own set of pros and cons. For example, pressing open is often the preferred method of modern quilters. They feel like it allows your blocks to lay flatter. They believe that your seams come out more consistently 1/4 inch because there's no fold like in this one. They think that you lose some fabric in the fold. Overall, the seam is less bulky and it's probably easier to quilt when you're finishing your quilt. It's easier to go over these less bulky seams than the bulkier seams of a folded or a pressed to the side seam. And just overall, they say that it gives a more neat, sort of a seamless, finished look to your quilt. Pressing to the side, however, is faster, I think, and it definitely makes a sturdier seam, although people will still argue about that too. You also have the option to press all of your fabric towards the darker fabric instead of the lighter fabric, which can make a big difference in like when you're doing high contrast combinations. So like if you have black and a white fabric and you press your fabric to the light, you're going to be able to see that seam allowance from the top. It's not quite as obvious with this color combination here, but it can make a huge difference and be really distracting if you have those high contrast colors and it shows up right along there. The majority of the time I am going to be pressing to the side because I do pinless piecing, and later on when I'm matching seams, you can use this technique called nesting your seams. And I'm going to tell you more about that later on when we're putting our blocks together, but it is a super great, easy way to match these the seams together with basically just by feel, instead of having to like be super careful and looking and pinning and all that. So that's what I usually do. So let's set this aside and I'll do a quick demo of pressing open. So I've got my seam right here, and I'm going to do something called finger pressing. And it's sort of just getting your fabric ready to press ahead of time, and it just helps get a neater seam, I think. So I'm going to run my fingers along the seam on the back to open it up, and I'm also going to do the same thing here. Then I'm going to press with my iron with my seam allowance facing up real gently, and remember, we're still pressing, not ironing. We're going to be very gentle. We don't want to iron anything out of shape. And then when I'm pressing open, I also like to flip it around and press it from the front as well. And at this point, you kind of want to give it a look to make sure that you've got it all the way open. You don't have anything creased over or any wasted fabric. You want it to be perfectly open. So let's do it again, a little closer. I'm going to open the seam. And on the back, I'm sort of running my fingers along the seam line. I guess it's the front. On the right side, I'm opening up the seam with my fingernails. I'll do the same here. Finger pressing. It's really a great step to make sure you get a good open seam. Some light pressing. And then flip it over. And press again. And I find if your blocks are coming away and they're not like as flat as you want them to be, sometimes it can help if you let them cool on your pressing surface. Wool mats are really great. They get you extra flat blocks, but if you're using just a plain ironing board, try leaving them to cool on the board before you move them, and it might help you get a flatter block. You also want to make sure that you're using the correct fabric setting on your iron, okay? Because you're going to get better results on cotton or linen than you will over here on cotton blends. So that's how you press them open. Let's get back to the pieces that we just sewed, and I'll press these to the side. So I want to press towards the darks of all of these pieces. So I'm going to put the dark side on top, the light side is on the bottom, and then I'm going to peel it open, and I'm going to do finger pressing, lightly scratch the seam open, if you will. I want to make sure that there isn't anything that's folded over incorrectly, no creases. And then when I take my iron, I'm going to lay it flat here and give just the tiniest bit of tension, and then use the edge of the iron to make sure I push the fabric over. So you might notice when I'm pressing my seams open, I'm pressing from the back where the seam allowance is, and when I'm pressing my seams to the side, I'm pressing from the top on the right side of the fabric. Okay, just like that. Looks pretty good. Let's do another one. So I'm going to have my darker fabric on top, open up the pieces, do a finger press, and don't go too crazy on the finger pressing because we don't want to stretch when we're finger pressing either. So just enough to, oh, here's a good example. I wasn't being very careful and I folded the fabric here. Can you see that? It should be just a little bit more open. See the difference? So I was flattening it, and that makes a little pocket, a little wastage of fabric. And if you do that, then your pieces won't be the right size. So make sure that's nice and open, nothing folded the wrong way. Add a little bit of tension, nothing too much, just barely any tension, and use the edge of your iron to open up the seam and press it over. If everything has gone correctly, you should have a nice straight seam and no wavering on the raw edges of your pieces. So you'll do that for all of these pieces that you have sewn, and then we'll match the pieces back up together in their next pairs and continue sewing. After that first round of piecing, you do it again. You match up your pieces. You have the right sides together. You pin or clip, right sides together, pin or clip. Then you take it to your sewing machine. After you're done sewing, you check if you've made any mistakes and you get your seam ripper involved. If you have, you fix what you can, you press, and then you start it over again. So there's sort of a rhythm to it. So you'll sew those, and then after these are sewn and pressed, you'll sew these two units together. And then voila, you have a finished block. So it's fairly simple. It is a bit repetitive, I admit, but that kind of repetitiveness is sort of like soothing and very zen for me. And a lot of people will listen to music or watch Netflix, or I think audiobooks are really great to listen to while you sew because you can have it in your pocket and it can move around with you just fine, and you don't have to keep looking up at a screen or something. So I definitely recommend doing something that keeps your mind busy as you're keeping your hands busy. And then once you hit that zone, you all of a sudden have finished all of your blocks and you're like, how did that happen? I feel like I just started. So go ahead and finish all of your blocks. Do it all at once or do batches, whichever you feel comfortable with. And then in the next video, we're going to talk about fudging the mistakes that we can't fix, or maybe some people aren't willing to fix them. We're going to square up our blocks. We're going to look at a couple different quilt layouts. And then finally, we're going to put it all together and finish our quilt top. So really exciting. I hope you have tons of fun. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. Thanks for spending time with me today, quilters. If you want to support this channel and help me buy supplies and materials for future videos, please visit my Buy Me a Coffee page linked in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss upcoming videos. And I'll see you again real soon. Bye!